welcome everyone who's joining us here on our webinar this afternoon. I'm Nick Gevock, and I'm the Conservation Director here at the Montana Wildlife Federation. And I'm joined today by Quentin Kujala, who is the Chief of Staff for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. He's here in Helena. And Jennifer Ramsey is a research wildlife veterinarian. Do I have that right, Jennifer? Yeah. She's with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and she works out of the Bozeman office. It's where the State Wildlife Lab is. So I want to thank both of you for joining me today about a subject that we continue to learn more about, refine our management. And so I'm going to start off today by letting Quentin just talk a little bit about chronic wasting disease, its history in Montana, and what we've done with management thus far. So Quentin, if you want to unmute yourself and just talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for the opportunity, and I'll do that. I also want to thank and point again to Dr. Ramsey as Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Wildlife Veterinarian. And you will see me, some questions more than others, quickly defer to her command of the details of the disease and many of the details of our surveillance for same. But yeah, I'll take a first stab. And Montana does have, what is a growing history with CWD, the topic, if not the actual disease infection. We have a couple of versions of plans. A couple of them, the first one's obviously being put in place prior to us identifying CWD, as we have now come to recognize its presence in Montana, starting with the detection in 2017. That history includes, in the 90s, not a free-ranging positive sample or free-ranging positive case, but a game farm case near Phillipsburg. And again, from the 90s until 2017, no detections in free-ranging wildlife. And then that changed. In the uncanny way the world sometimes works. The first detection came back. The test confirming a positive came back literally on the day the Fish and Wildlife Commission was endorsing in a final fashion, making final adoption of the most recent iteration of the state's CWD management plan. I back up that plan has now been modified annually a couple times, but those have been, in this conversation, we might call them tweaks out of our growing experience. So was really fortunate. Dr. Ramsey was instrumental in assembling those details, and we were fortunate not in the sense that we found we have CWD in the state, but we're fortunate in that a lot of pre-work had been put in place to help us understand and move forward with whatever next steps that circumstance requires. And so it was incredibly timely. Like I say, we literally picked up the management plan as it had been almost literally moments before adopted. Of course, we knew what that content was. And many of Montana's landowners and sportsmen and other wildlife enthusiasts, have either been watching CWD efforts and the disease itself since then. They probably are familiar with things like initially transport restriction areas as a piece of our management that's designed to, recognizing the disease. And Nick, I understand you'll look to Dr. Ramsey to help us understand more of the components of the disease itself, but suffice it here to say the disease has a infectious element to it. And one of the ways to address that, the spread, the human enhanced spread of disease, is to limit the movement of infected carcass parts, specifically brains and spinal cords. Initially, our management approach looked to put in place defined areas, transport restriction areas, we were calling them, around those positives that had been detected. That is to say, you couldn't take those parts out of that defined area. As the positives grew, as our surveillance grew, one positive leading to an expansion of look and expansion of surveillance, finding another positive, hunters submitting their samples independent of our focused efforts on the landscape. Again, growing positives, growing our awareness of just how widespread CWD, in fact, appears to be in Montana. We ran into, the next issue of implementation, the next problem in implementation, which is keeping ourselves current and keeping the public current with those changing boundaries and definitions of the transport restriction areas. So, out of that, the most recent step in that evolution of experience and response is to have moved now to a carcass disposal requirement. So that's a common commission action. It's a commission action that speaks commonly to everybody as they harvest a cervid across in any place in Montana, not just in areas known to be CWD positive. But in short, a hunter taking a deer, an elk, or a moose in Montana, has the choice of leaving, the carcass parts that they're not going to consume at the kill site, or depositing at least the brain material in the spinal column in a Class 2 landfill. And again, that's to prohibit those prions, the infectious agent of the disease, from being spread inadvertently by hunters returning home from perhaps some distant point in Montana, from a place that has CWD potentially to a place that doesn't have CWD. So again, that's one of our management actions to your prompt here to speak to management, Nick. The other management, the management intent, the overall intent is not to pursue eradication, elimination of the disease now that it's been found in Montana, but to manage the disease and its presence, to keep as low as possible its prevalence. We initially started, I forget the specific language, we specifically talked about in the plan responding, looking to keep prevalence at a 5% prevalence rate, infection rate across a population as something that would trigger management actions. We've since become more aggressive and have adjusted in the plan that if we find CWD, whatever its prevalence, whatever its infection rate, we will look to minimize that infection across that population. And in short, the biggest tool in Montana has perhaps happenstance, a serendipitous good fortune here, in that one of the approaches that that has some potential to be effective is to keep deer density, to keep deer concentrations, local concentrations to a minimum. Deer and any animals in tight quarters, in concentrated quarters, enhances. I think it's easy to envision just at a intuitive level that those close quarters enhance the potential for infection from one individual to another. And so to the degree, those close concentrations can be minimized either at local scales, focusing on, specific dense groups, or perhaps also at a population scale to keep densities down across a broader landscape. That's the approach. Again, the target is to keep prevalence as low as possible, the intent. And what I meant to say earlier, that Montana maybe has some good fortune already in place, is that, Montana has always approached the bulk of the hunting season to be, as much opportunity as the resource will allow, while still maintaining the viability of those populations. And so lots of general license opportunities scattered across the state, lots of second and third license opportunities, depending on what the species is you're talking about at the time. Management intends to keep those populations, below their highs, as some of those species more than others, might fluctuate dramatically from one year to another. So that all kind of fits with the management direction, and the management tool all kind of fits with the way Montana has always approached the hunting seasons to begin with. We know there are some places where, we deliberately limit the harvest of the male portion of the population, those what we might call big buck areas, or trophy buck areas, or trophy bull areas. We know there are some of those scattered across the state. They tend to be the minority of the hunting districts. And those represent really good questions for us to keep in mind in light of CWD, recognizing that those older age male individuals do represent a relative high infection vector for us to be thinking about. So I'll stop there, Nick. Maybe that's too much rambling, but anticipating there'll be follow-up questions to hit whatever I missed or didn't hit well.
Sure. No, that's a great introduction. And I think, last year was our first year those of us recall that our first detection was in Carbon County down there in the Red Lodge country. And then as well, that same fall up in Liberty County. And I'd like Dr. Ramsey to talk a little bit. So last year was our first year of large scale testing statewide. We sampled about 7,000 animals. And I remember the Ken McDonald, the Wildlife Division Chief, saying that our estimate was about 2% prevalence, and he pretty much nailed it. That's what we know right now. So we also, Dr. Ramsey, if you could talk a little bit about what we found last year in the testing, and then move into a little bit about why we are going to these statewide carcass. Well, Quentin touched on that, but just talk a little bit about this change with the carcass movement, which I think is very important for hunters to understand. And you're muted, Doctor.
There we go. So you broke up a little bit, so if I don't answer some of your questions, just let me know. But it sounded like you were asking what we found last year. And one thing that I just want to mention is that our staff are working on a CWD dashboard that will go on our website hopefully pretty soon. And that's going to be updated almost in real time. So hunters will have access to test results and kind of the statistics on what we're finding and where tests are coming from really quickly. So last year, we found the Libby area to be positive. That wasn't an area that our models that we were using predicted, but we found that found positive deer there in the urban area in Libby. And then also we found some positives in Madison. A couple of places last year, I think one of the takeaways last year was that there were a couple of places that we found positives that we hadn't predicted based on modeling. We did offer hunter testing statewide to any hunter who wanted testing free of charge last year for the first time ever. And so we got a really large sampling from across the state. When folks go and look at our maps, they'll see that there are still some areas in the state that we don't have enough data to know for sure whether the disease is present or absent. And we'll work on those. I think this year we're expecting to potentially even double the number of samples. I think these detections in places that weren't predicted will be a motivating factor for a lot of hunters to have more interest in some. And then we're doing priority surveillance areas where we're actively setting up sampling stations to collect samples that will be used for determination of prevalence in some areas. So I think we're going to have, it looks like we're going to have a high number of samples. And just during the archery season, we've already seen quite a few more samples this archery season than last year. So if that's predictive, then I think we're going to have a really good sampling of the state this year again. I think your other question was in regard to the carcass disposal rule. And that's really important. Quentin already talked about some of the reasons why we changed, went from the transport restriction zones to a carcass disposal rule. Transport restriction zones were really, I think, difficult for everybody to kind of stay aware. Even staff had a hard time following where those boundaries were, and then those boundaries got confused with management zone boundaries. So all those different terms for these different areas got to be really hard to keep organized, and it was really hard for people to know exactly where they were, where the boundaries were. So the carcass disposal rule, the rule is simple. So hopefully that will make it easier for folks to comply. And then, it really is just a matter of trying to limit any, transmission that's being perpetuated by human behavior. So we can't control what the animals or how they're moving around on the landscape, but we can stop, that carcass dumping piece would be a huge advantage. And when an animal has CWD, the prions are, most of the prions are going to be in the central nervous system, but especially in the late stage disease, prions can be found throughout the carcass. So, and that carcass is dumped on the landscape, it's a source of infection. And the prions are very hardy in the environment So once they're dumped somewhere, they're going to be there for years. So that's really a significant effort if we can get folks to comply with the carcass disposal rule.
Yeah, and so I just came from camping along the Yellowstone River in eastern Montana, and I noticed a sign. The agency has really stepped up a sign saying, "Do not dump your carcasses here." I really appreciate that. Dr. Ramsey, can you talk a little bit about I think it's great that we've gone to this statewide uniform rule on carcass management. No, you have areas where you want to get better, a better sample size of the animals there. But, I, like you, the one in the Ruby Valley was really a shocker to us last year. And then, of course, Libby, and that turned out to be a huge hotspot. So it's fair to say that CWD is potentially everywhere in Montana now. But would you talk about that? But also, what are these areas where you haven't had a lot of samples? What regions of the state where you'd like to see more?
Yeah, so if I could show you a map right now, that would probably be really helpful. But folks can get that information on our website. And then once this dashboard is set up, it actually has a map that shows highlighted areas where we know it's present, and we even have a good idea on what prevalence is. It also identifies areas where we have a good sample size, a reasonably good sample size, and we haven't detected the disease. So if it's there at a very low prevalence. And then there's still a large portion of the state, kind of that big midsection of the state, where we just don't have enough data yet to say. So, part of our effort is kind of filling in those gaps. And, when hunters are submitting these samples, it worked out really well that with hunters, across the state submitting samples on their own, regardless of whether they're in a priority surveillance area or not. It has shown us that we learned from that, because that's how we detected it in some of these areas earlier than we would have eventually. So we'll keep working on that, but there is a kind of a large section of the center of the state that's not been heavily surveyed enough yet to have confidence.
Around Lewistown, maybe Fergus County, and moving in all directions. Interesting. Right. Because it was first pushing down from northeast Montana. I remember up, well, no, not first, but I know we had some detections around Glasgow relatively early. Again, I get back to Carbon County, Liberty County, and then again, Libby really caught us off guard. That was so surprising. But and let me see, what other questions would I have for you two? Or I don't know if you have any questions coming in. I think there's nothing requiring people to get their animals tested, right? That is, but that is something obviously we want. That is a hunter's choice, and it provides tremendous data to the agency, right?
Yeah, we don't have any of the special CWD hunts going on this season. So we don't have any of those where in the past there have been some of those where testing was part of the plan there to really hone in on the prevalence estimate. We don't have any of those required samplings this season. It's all voluntary. Obviously, especially in those priority surveillance areas, we're really encouraging hunters to submit those samples, because we need that data to determine prevalence.
Yeah.
And then outside of those areas, we still recommend, if you're hunting in an area where CWD is present, that you should test the animal before you consume it. But any hunter who would like to know whether their animal is infected with CWD, we're happy to test those samples as well.
So I know we don't have maps here, but even I don't know, and I will go, what are those priority areas this year where we're trying to gain more data?
Yeah, so it's kind of the northwest corner,
okay.
Around region 3, and then in the southeastern corner are our main priority surveillance areas this year. And I can't show you I don't have that in front of me, but those are kind of the general areas. And again, that'll all be on part of that website that's coming sometime soon.
Right.
And there'll
Well,
be sampling stations set up in those areas
right.
to kind of facilitate sample collection in those places where we're really asking for samples.
Right. Well, and that's one thing I would say on here to all hunters is I would encourage everyone to go. I know I'm going to go look at that site once it's up and going and just continue to educate myself more about what we're looking at. Even if I don't hunt in those areas, I want to know. And, you know, I think of the places you've mentioned too have some fairly high concentrations of deer where they're not only just raw numbers, but fairly concentrated. I mean, I think of the Ruby Valley could be, and in fact, I have a member I just found out had a, it looks like a positive white-tailed doe in the Gallatin Valley who contacted me last week. So I don't know. I can't recall if last year we had any from the Gallatin. But
Our first one here was, that was a deer that I went out on, and I can't remember what month it was. I feel like it was this spring though. It was this spring, I can't remember what month, that we had a symptomatic deer in the Bozeman area.
And once again, Dr. Ramsey, will the tests this year be a little bit quicker? Are they going to the lab in Bozeman?
So yeah, so right now, we are using the Montana Veterinary Diagnostic Lab right now for our deer and elk samples. They're working on getting the IHC up and running so that they can do moose, but they're not quite there yet. So we're still sending moose samples to Colorado. So the Montana Veterinary Diagnostic Lab will be our primary lab this year. And once they get online for the moose IHC, we'll send those there as well. So far, during the archery season, the turnaround time has been really, really short. You know, that's probably going to vary depending on, you know, the sample volume that they're getting. But so far it's been really good. So that's been nice. And yeah, so we're kind of optimistic about that.
What do you mean by short? Can you, I mean?
Well, some of our initial samples were, I mean, the testing part of the situation. There's always the data entry and getting it posted and all that, and getting hunters called back, but we were getting results.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second there. In how many days?
Just a few. Just some of those were like 2 to 3 days.
Okay.
For the testing results. Yeah.
Great. Okay, and I don't know if we have any questions coming in or not, I guess, but Quentin, do you have anything to add to this? Again, I mean, we're encouraging hunters. Your hunters are doing the agency and obviously our wildlife and themselves a big favor by getting these samples. And the other thing, and I'll even admit this, I'm an experienced hunter, is I still need to watch the video on how to extract the lymph nodes. So, I mean, but Quentin, I don't know if you had anything to add to this or.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Just connecting with pieces of the conversation that have already come forward, to the point of hunters collecting their self-collecting samples from the animals they've harvested. There's another facet to that that's perhaps worth mentioning here, and that's, one of the things that a lot of hunters in Montana do is donate their wild game to food bank networks. And so Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Emily and some of her peers have been working close with, the food bank network, and they've been great partners, and Department of Health and Human Services, as there's a human safety question here as well. And that they've been working, for some time, and the focus for this most recent pre-hunting season conversation has been, how to address those donations to minimize the potential for CWD positive carcasses to find their way into that food bank network. And, at the end of that conversation, suffice it here perhaps to say that as we visit with hunters, a request, an urge, an ask to them that if they do have an eye to donating to a food bank network, and again, that that's much appreciated by the recipients, by the food bank network themselves. But if they do have that intent, being diligent about sampling and submitting those samples before they actually make that donation would be, consistent with CDC guidelines, consistent with the intent to keep those positive carcasses out of that network. Again, we'd ask the hunters to keep that in mind as and if they are approaching that end to their carcass.
I'm wondering, Quentin, has, and I know that as Neil Anderson up in Region 1 said, it is not the business of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to tell private meat processors how to run their business. But I saw a story in the Billings Gazette. I saw the headline. I haven't read it yet, and that hunters might have a hard time finding meat processors this year. I don't know if some of them are getting entirely out of doing game, or if there have been any conversations within FWP about that.
Yeah, Nick, I'll take a first stab, and Jennifer may have some additional detail to add. But yeah, from the beginning, there's been the question, well, if you're a hunter, how do you look at meat processing, recognizing that it's not just your meat that's going through that process, and from the processor's perspective, how to answer questions of concern, questions of curiosity from hunters now that this thing that is CWD is on the landscape, and all those parties recognizing and understanding to one degree or another the infectious nature, the infectious agent, the difficulty in destroying the infectious agent. And we've heard a diversity to your comment about Neil Anderson's remark. We've heard a diversity of response, and I think we've seen a diversity of response as those individual operations, make the decisions that are best for their circumstance. And as I understand, on top of that, it sounds like there are other workloads this particular year that don't necessarily prompt some meat processors to turn to wild game like they perhaps have in the past. Jennifer, I don't know if you've had anything else to add about some of the specific approaches we've seen some meat processors take.
I tend to forget to take the mute off. Yeah, I've talked to a few processors. I know a lot of our regional staff talk to processors pretty frequently, and it sounds like there's quite a adaptations on how to deal with it. There are some folks who are going to just single animal processing so that, they don't have to worry about, that chain of tracking, when you get a positive animal that's, processed with the batch, then public health will work on trying to identify anyone who received meat from that batch. So because of that kind of situation, some folks have gone to just single animal processing, but not all. And folks who are doing batch processing, I think some of those folks are trying to do a really good job of keeping track of every, animal that's in that batch so that they have that information available if by chance a positive is detected. So I think there are different strategies folks are using to try to adapt.
Has anybody heard of a meat processor, either of you, who just flat out says we're not going to take an animal until they show us that negative test? Or no?
I don't know if Nick, I don't know if I've seen that literally, but certainly it's easy to wonder, just as you have here, if that's not one of the approaches that some folks will take, either out of concern for, their out of interest for their some piece of their business model, some piece of their marketing that they're trying to manage, and or just trying to keep away from the logistic of keeping track of everything that Dr. Ramsey alluded to. Trying to avoid that by just having only negative test result animals coming in across the counter.
I guess my next question for both of you is more from a wildlife conservation standpoint. I'm thinking a lot about, we early on, we being the Montana Wildlife Federation, we were like, eradicate this. But I think we've come to accept that in reality, eradication is probably not a realistic goal. But at what level of prevalence in a herd will we start to see declines in herds to the point of, it affecting our wildlife populations? And I'd like both of your perspective on that.
Dr. Ramsey, I'll let you go first on that one.
It's a pretty big question.
Yeah, I would just say that, based on some of the literature that's come out of Colorado and Wyoming, I don't know that they have a specific prevalence at which the decline started, but I know that some of the data suggests that once the prevalence is 20%, then they do see real declines in populations.
Okay. And Quentin, you want to take a stab at that?
No, just to offer, to restate that at just a larger scale. So this is different from some other diseases that in wildlife that Montana has some experience where the impact to the wildlife species host does not manifest as a population scale impact, a reduction. CWD is not that class of disease. There's researched evidence out there. There's monitoring evidence out there that over time, CWD does have a hand in reducing cervid populations.
Right. I know I've read about some. Oh, go ahead, Jen.
Kind of following up with that, just thinking about chronic wasting disease and comparing it to a lot of the other diseases that we think about with wildlife, we have to think a little bit differently because we have to think over a much longer time span. It's hard for us to kind of the management tools that we have, the harvest, and some people might say that the treatment is worse than the disease, and that but the problem is you have to look at it over decades, not just a year or two. So it's a chronic, slowly progressing disease that hopefully actions that we take now will be a benefit decades down the road.
Well, I will say that, because we do know that bucks are a bigger vector for its spread, that Montana being largely an opportunity state, particularly, both with whitetails and mule deer, hopefully that approach helps us. I mean, people who want to see big trophies might not like that, but from a wildlife conservation and a herd health standpoint, hopefully that keeps us down in that 2%. If we can keep this at 2%, we can live with this, is what we've kind of said. I mean, that's basically 1 out of 50 deer. We really haven't talked about elk as much. I know even in Wyoming, the prevalence is a little lower in elk, isn't it? Can you talk about that, Dr. Ramsey, a little bit?
Yeah, prevalence is generally lower in elk than either mule deer or white-tailed deer. And we talk about deer here in Montana. We just don't have the sample sizes in elk to establish prevalence.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your work. And frankly, your entire agency. I guess if we have a message to hunters, it is get out those lymph nodes, follow those carcass rules, either leave those unused parts of the carcass right where you harvested that animal, or take it to a class 2 landfill. And then, and lastly, I would encourage everyone to go to the FWP's website, look at these areas, because, hunters, we've long been leaders in wildlife conservation. We're partners with the agency. And, what I keep saying in legislative committee hearings is the worst outcome would be if hunters stop participating. I mean, that is our best wildlife management tool. And if we lose that, we're going to be in a world of hurt. I know Wisconsin has, they took a very different approach for a while, and they were really hitting deer hard, and that people didn't like seeing that. So on the other hand, Wyoming, took a a little bit of a hands-off approach early on. And I know there's some herds down there that are something like 48% positive. Is that in the Casper area or something? So I feel fortunate that Montana FWP is getting on this early and doing things to do what we can to keep this prevalence as low as possible. And do you agree, Dr. Ramsey? If we can keep this at 2%, we should be okay. You're muted again.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, the evidence suggests that eradication would be great, but it's probably it's not feasible.
Yeah.
My computer's frozen up. I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh yeah, no, you're good.
So assuming that, you know, eradication is not feasible, we need to try to slow and limit the spread.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do with the management tools that we have.
Right. Well, I will say I am very grateful also that we have an in-state lab to test this now. That came up a lot in the Environmental Quality Council in the interim here. If not that Colorado State didn't do a good job for us, but I think it was just a function of time, right? And that lab is used so heavily by numerous states. And so I think people think, well, if I can hang a deer in my garage or in my storage shed for a few days, if I get that sample back in 4 or 5 days, that's pretty fair. So I want to thank you for that as well. And yeah, let's just encourage hunters. The last thing I'll say is we have a Montana Wildlife Federation CWD pledge that we're encouraging all hunters to go take, to read over and to do their part to be partners and engaged in this. And that's just at montanawildlife.org, and you'll see a CWD pledge. So
Nick?
do we have any final thoughts, Quentin? Anything that we missed here or that you wanted to get in? Or?
Yeah, I would just with some of your remarks there, and would certainly make room here for Dr. Ramsey to speak too. But, you know, you talk about reaching out to hunters and, you know, Hunters Pledge, and that's great. You know, hunters we've seen great interest. You know, they've given us a lot of opportunity to, you know, reach out and into specific forums. And, you know, they've certainly continued to participate, not just in testing, but you heard Dr. Ramsey reference as one of the management tools, a CWD management hunt, where we define an area and have a real focused harvest attention to better understand just exactly how widely spread and what is the prevalence, if we can get enough numbers of samples, the disease is in that area. And so hunters have been great stepping up to the plate, you know, and helping with those efforts as, you know, the harvesters of those deer leading to those samples. And you know, in the same vein, talking about partners, you know, you can imagine quickly that, you know, landowners in that example of CWD management hunt, you know, need to be identified. They've been great as well to, you know, we hear from them an interest in better understanding the disease, better understanding, just as your questions here today, Nick, what is the state's approach to this? And so we've seen great collaboration and cooperation and interest and awareness from the landowning community too, in pursuit of more awareness. And then, you know, Nick, you referenced, you know, 2 other entities that I'd like to take an opportunity to recognize as partners. We talked about two others, the Food Bank Network and Department of Health and Human Services. You mentioned, and Dr. Ramsey referenced the Montana Diagnostic Laboratory. That's under the oversight of Montana Department of Livestock. Both the agency and the lab staff have been great to work with. And you know, we're fortunate that we have what we think is a great working relationship with the agency and staff that predates this topic. And then also, Nick, you mentioned EQC, the Legislative Interim Committee. You know, they dedicated a sizable, I think the biggest share of their, you know, meeting resources to this topic. And for those that are more interested in, you know, all the corners of CWD that their exploration took them, you know, those are recorded meetings as well. And I think every agenda that interim committee looked at some facet or another of CWD. So lots of interest, lots of concern. It's about wildlife in the state of Montana. We know that's a big deal, and people have really responded, like I say, with their interest and participation. And one last piece I'd also offer, and I don't mean, I offer it last, I don't mean to suggest it's least, not at all, but in vetting, the development of our CWD management plan, we assembled a citizen advisory council that helped us understand how the public might look at this, how the public might understand it or not understand it, how we might best communicate it, what they would be tolerant of, what they would be most concerned with. And that group has been really helpful. And it's a diverse group and called for interested parties, and a good host stepped forward, and we were able to select a really diverse committee that's really stepped up to the task and has contributed much to this effort. So I just apologize for not bringing that forward in my initial introduction, but your comments, Nick, about reaching out to hunters and other partners included in this effort, it really is a wide array of conservationists by one definition or another.
I'm glad you said that, Quentin, because I overlooked that landowners have been great partners, of course, as they always are in conserving wildlife habitat. And, this isn't a disease that affects the livestock industry, quite, something like a brucellosis, but they've still taken an interest because they love wildlife just like we do. So, and secondly, the EQC I was very thankful, and I let them know that for their really sincere interest in this. And that was really the focus of this interim. I was so impressed. Dr. Ramsey, well, you were both there in the January meeting where we had people from both Wyoming and Colorado's wildlife agencies come on, and they were very candid. This is what we did well, and this is what we didn't do so well. And we learned from that. They were very complimentary of your work, Dr. Ramsey and Emily Almberg. And, but, they said, hey, we're still learning, and they're a couple decades into it, some of them. But Dr. Ramsey, I don't know if you had any closing thoughts or anything that we missed there that you'd want to say.
No, I think we're gearing up right now. Today, we've been in training with some of our CWD technicians for the season, and getting them all the tools that they'll need to provide the service to the hunters that'll be coming through their sampling stations. And just looking forward to a successful and safe season. COVID makes things a little different this year. So people will notice when they come to a sampling station, there'll be signs and masks and those kinds of things, those precautions in place just to try to, keep people safe. And yeah, I think we're going to have a good year. We've got, the testing in place with the Montana Diagnostic Lab, and I think this is going to be a good season, and we're going to hopefully learn a lot again this year.
Yeah. And I should say that we had this event, and we had Emily Almberg was listed. No, because Dr. Ramsey joined me for a similar event about a month ago, and she's busy training the people who are going to be taking these lymph nodes literally as we're on this call or on this webinar. So, but anyway, well, I want to thank you both. I think this is great. The more we get the word out, the better. I also notice that the agency is getting signs up at fishing access sites, state park, various recreation sites where people may be dumping carcasses in the past, and they're simple. They're pretty direct in their message, and they're getting the word out. And of course, here at the Montana Wildlife Federation, we want to be partners. We have all of our communication channels to continue to just push this message and get hunters informed. So with that, thanks to both of you. Hopefully I have a couple deer samples to give you guys if I can be successful, and an elk. So
thanks back, Nick, for the opportunity for another piece of outreach here. That much appreciated.
You bet.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to sign off. Thanks, everyone. And hopefully everybody has a successful hunting season and gets those samples.
Yeah. Best wishes. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.